All right. I want to thank all of you for coming. Um, Tonight we're going to do a couple of things, all involving election integrity, which is sort of the what got this organization, Look Ahead America, started. Um, and I'll tell you kind of how we arrived at the election integrity public policy objectives that have come up with. Uh, as some of you may know, in the aftermath of the 2020 general election, I started the Voter Integrity Project because I thought that the election was very close and it would be worthwhile to run some analyses that had never been done before to see if we could determine if there were any illegal ballots that had been cast. In the course of that, did a lot of media, had a lot of people asking questions. So what could be done to prevent this from happening in the future? How could this be stopped? And it wasn't a question that I had thought about a whole lot until they started asking it. So I started developing these ideas because I needed to give a competent answer. And over the first couple of months of Look Ahead America's life, I sort of set aside kind of a group of people who would help me compose these public policy objectives. And I was traveling around the country at the time, talking to a lot of different people on this issue and collecting ideas. And what we settled on were 6 public policy objectives that I think have a couple things going for them. Number one is that they are unique. And when I say unique, is that we've all heard a lot of the ideas that have been shared in the past. Some of them are sort of staples, like requiring ID, government-issued ID to cast a ballot. Some of them are maybe outside the scope of what is quite feasible, which would be outlawing all mail ballots. You must absolutely always vote in person, or all votes must be counted by hand. And those are all great ideas, but they're just a little bit beyond the scope of what we think is probably achievable within the next couple of election cycles, at least across the board. The other thing that I thought that our objectives have going for them is that they're not particularly partisan, and they also don't suffer from accusations of being biased. In fact, some of these we have historically found bipartisan support for. And we can talk about that as I go through them. So these are what I believe are practical, within reach objectives that we can work on as an organization and as a country that can help restore confidence in the elections. And look, I know we've documented thousands and thousands and thousands of illegal ballots in this country. We documented more than the margin of victory in Georgia and Wisconsin. We still have some studies going underway in Arizona and Pennsylvania. So we know that this problem is out there. But we know that just as big a problem is the suspicion that elections are not on the up and up, that they aren't being run with integrity. And that is, I think, just as damaging to the kind of government we have now, or democratic form of government, because we can all complain about healthcare, tort reform, potholes, foreign policy, et cetera, and we can kind of understand that it's not always going to go our way, but we accept that sometimes because we just understand that elections have consequences. But that's all premised on the elections being clean and fair and accurately accounted for. So that's why I think that these public policy objectives on election integrity are so important. And, I've heard a lot of schools of thought, some people saying, we can't move forward to 2022 without solving 2020, or 2020 happened, we got to focus on the next election, et cetera. And I think that in some ways that's a false dichotomy. Really, we've got to take actions that fix the flaws in the election system, and by their nature, these fixes will help restore confidence. That's it. That's it. That's simple. So I'm going to go through them, and after I get to each one, I will stop and I will look in the typing chat to see if anybody has a question about any of them. And I will sort of take those questions in turn as we cover each of these public policy objectives. So again, all of these sort of satisfy 3 requirements. Number 1, they eliminate a vulnerability in the election system. Number 2, they are practical. And number 3, they are in harmony with state and federal laws. Because that's, it's just the world we live in. Are those laws necessarily right, moral, make sense? But that's where we are. And all of these objectives are targeted at the state legislature. And when we get to the end, I'll talk about how you can advance them. Because trust me, it is worlds easier to advance an objective at the state legislative level from where we are as an organization, from where each of you are personally, than it is to start considering things at the federal level. Now, first of all, number 1, thumbprint authentication of absentee ballots. To me, this is the most exciting and I think promising objective because it solves so many problems. So we kept hearing things in the past election about signature verification. The signature on the absentee ballots coming in through the mail match what's on file, and that is a massively difficult subjective judgment, because I can tell you I don't know if I've ever signed my name on a mail-in ballot or absentee ballot in a way that I have no idea how I signed it when I first registered to vote in my home state where I've been voting for many years. When I was 17 years old, I don't think I signed my name the same way. I think it's a struggle for a lot of people, and it just becomes something so much subjective. The other problem with not having a thumbprint is that you don't know who actually cast the ballot. You could have somebody who received the ballot in the mail at an address where that person didn't live, and somebody could cast and just put down a signature. Or for somebody that they know that no longer lives there, that's passed away, or somebody who's no longer entitled to vote for any of the number of reasons you lose your right to vote. What a thumbprint does is it solves the signature problem because the machine reads it instantly and matches it. Like I used to use as a prop at what is now about a 10-year-old cell phone, say, hey, this thing can instantly read my fingerprint. Think about the slow process of counting absentee ballots and having to look at the signature and how it's a human process of just looking at each one and trying to compare it. With a machine, it can scan these things instantly and match it based on the voter ID number to the thumbprint and just say, oh, that's the person, or kick it out when it isn't a match. This is also a tremendous disincentive for anybody to cast multiple ballots or to cast a ballot in somebody's name other than theirs, because now, I mean, a signature is one thing, but a thumbprint, I mean, that's getting into CSI territory, and I think that on its own is a pretty good disincentive against cheating. And again, I think it actually helps enfranchise a lot of people who maybe are elderly or have physical disabilities where they can't consistently sign their name. This takes away that problem. For those of you who are not aware of how the mail-in ballots and it currently works, I'll sort of summarize that. There are 4 envelopes in an absentee ballot. There's the absentee ballot overall outside envelope that they use to send it to the voter. Inside that is the envelope that the voter is supposed to send everything back to the elections office. Inside that is the affidavit envelope where you sign, your name and the date and maybe a witness depending on the state. And inside that is another envelope number 4, where the ballot goes. So what happens is when the ballot gets mailed back to the county clerk's office, first they tear out the outside envelope, so it's just the absentee affidavit envelope where you sign your name and sworn. And that's the one that they make sure, okay, this is a ballot we sent out, this is a ballot that's supposed to be returned, this person has not sent back multiple ballots, and this is also the time where if you have an objection to make to that voter, being an illegitimate voter because they don't live in the district anymore or whatever, you can make it. And then once that voter is deemed to be legitimate, open that envelope up, and they have the envelope with the ballot in it, they put it aside, and then they open up separate from that, they open up all the envelopes with the ballots and strip them out and put them into a pile. So it's on that affidavit envelope where the signatures and they verify everything. That's where this thumbprint would go. And I've actually priced out the cost of including this in that packet of things that goes out with the absentee ballot. And we're talking about like a penny. I can say, well, thousands and thousands of ballots, a penny can really increase the cost. But remember, much of the legislation that's been proposed at the federal level and is in effect at the state level requires the state in recent years, this cycle or future cycles, to pay the postage for the return ballot, because you used to have to, in some states, you still have to get a stamp and mail it back. That's like 50 cents these days. So adding a very small marginal cost that I think actually ends up saving money because you no longer have the time-consuming task of signature verification. And you say, okay, so moving forward, when people register to vote, on the voter registration form, we have a little block where they put their thumbprint. What about all the people who have already been registered? Are they going to have to all register to vote again? The answer is no. The first time they cast a new ballot, absentee ballot, that thumbprint becomes their prime, that all future ballots get compared against. And the first time they cast a ballot through absentee ballot, the first time they cast an absentee ballot with that thumbprint on it, first of all, they can't cast a duplicate ballot, right? Because it's going to match against something else. And moving on to future elections, it will be matched back to that prime. So it's not like we have to re-register everybody. Now, I do hear an objection from the more libertarian quarters, always so helpful, saying that, well, I don't want the government to have my fingerprint on file. Well, there's 2 answers to that. Number one is that we can make sure through statute and technology that when the county office or the state, which records the prime thumbprint, either when you register the first time you cast an absentee ballot with it, we can make sure that it is encrypted with a one-way hash that cannot be used to recreate your fingerprint in the other way. So it can be basically securely stored, so it only can be used for comparing to your fingerprint, when they get a subsequent absentee ballot in. The second is that, well, look, if you don't want the government to have access to your fingerprints, then you can't do an absentee ballot anyway, because your fingerprints are already all over it. You handled it. And it is, with today's technology, completely possible to, pull your signature off of any piece of paper. Like, I'm just touching this now, they can pull my prints off of this. So I think that's a pretty good rebuttal to folks who would raise the privacy issue. And, you have the same privacy issue when it comes to, well, I have to show a government an ID to cast a ballot. That's a privacy issue too, in exactly the same way. So this is the one I think is the most powerful for preventing probably the biggest avenue for illegal ballots, which is casting ballots in someone else's name through the mail. And it's, media has written about it. Before the 2020 general election, the Washington Post said this was the most likely and largest potential way for illegal ballots to be cast, that we may not actually know who the deserved winner is for elections because of mail-in ballots fraud. So yeah, and I'm seeing a comment from Darcy that is correct, that states often require fingerprint driver's license. They also require all 10 prints for concealed carry. Don't ask me how I know that, but that's the case. So does anybody have any questions about the thumbprint authentication of absentee ballots public policy initiative? You can type those in chat. While anybody's thinking about those questions, I do want to add, I'm very proud that the state of Texas, this was at least introduced as a piece of legislation. It did not pass. However, this is something unique from us that they picked up from us, and it's not unusual for multiple legislative sessions and election cycles to go by before an idea that is first introduced and completely rejected actually eventually gets put into law. And I'll also tell you that this is widely used in many election systems around the country, namely South Korea. You don't show an ID at all when you go to vote in South Korea. You put your thumb down, it identifies you, gives you a ballot, you return it. That's it. So it's all thumbprint generated, and I mean, if South Korea can do it, I don't see why we cannot. Moving on to the next one. This is a big one, and this one caused this was where a lot of Look Ahead America's focus was in the Voter Integrity Project, identifying illegal ballots, and that is mandated and public voter list hygiene. So the government has a lot of different databases that can be used to identify people on the voter list, the official voter rolls that states hold, that are no longer eligible to cast ballots in that state. Probably the most famous of those is probably the Social Security Death Index or the Master Death File. The government does keep a database with full Social Security numbers and all that stuff of when somebody dies, and with name, full name, date of birth, Social Security number held up against a voter list, you can very easily identify that and remove it. And a lot of states do that to some extent. But what they don't do is take advantage of other government databases that are just as reliable, and peer-reviewed, published studies show they're just as reliable, which number one of which is the National Change of Address Database. When you file to have your mail forwarded, usually do that with a little postcard, or you used to do it with a little postcard. Now you go online, you pay like a $1 fee with a credit card to authenticate you're really you. That database is stored by the U.S. Postal Service and sold by the Postal Service. They make a lot of money with that. They make a lot of money because catalog sales and banks and et cetera want to make sure that they're getting their mail for you to the right address. It's very cheap for them to update it. It's very expensive to send mail to a wrong address, relatively speaking. So that's a tool that when you can, again, take a voter list and hold it up against the permanent National Change of Address Database, you can identify people who no longer live where they're registered to vote and may in fact have moved out of state. Now, sometimes there are valid reasons to do that, and that's why this government has multiple supplemental databases to make comparisons to, such as the driver's license database. They can determine whether or not you've picked up a new driver's license in another state. Again, when you have full name and date of birth and the last 4 digits of Social Security, the probability of mismatch is effectively zero. It's effectively zero. And look, we're not saying for states to automatically do this. We're saying that use this as your first step to determine whether or not that person is real, is really a legitimate voter or not. So if they show up on National Change of Address, send a letter saying, hey, are you still a legitimate voter in the state. In some cases with national change of address, they are still legitimate because they're in the military or there's some kind of educational exemption or they're married to somebody in the military and they get moved around. Or they've taken a job with their congressman's office, which also entitles them to vote back in the district they are from. So all of these different databases should be taken advantage of for mandatory hygiene, but that's not enough. The state also needs to publicly mark on the voter records when there has been a hit against one of these other databases. So the outside organizations, let's say state of Florida runs their whole voter database and they flag, 10,000 people as having moved out of the state, not being legitimate. They're still trying to discover whether they're legitimate or not, right? Look at America can look through those and provide supplemental evidence to the state because we see that they've already flagged them using databases that we can't match at the same granularity to, specifically driver's license databases, property tax databases, and do our own research, providing additional documentation to show that they've moved out of state, or evidence to show that they really are entitled to still vote and they should not be removed from the voter list. There are organizations on both sides of this who would take advantage of the public voter list hygiene. Look, when the state removes somebody or tries to remove somebody from a voter list, sometimes it's a mistake. We don't want anybody disenfranchised. So there should be a period where the state marks that person as publicly pending being removed so that either a nonprofit organization like us or some other government agency or something can go and investigate that and determine if there's any supplemental evidence that should be taken into consideration. So again, we're not trying to disenfranchise anybody here. We're trying to enfranchise everybody that's entitled to be franchised while maintaining a clean voter list, because when you've got a voter list with a bunch of dead wood on it, it's a potential avenue for illegal ballots to be cast and for undercutting the confidence in the elections, which is so important. Before I move on to the next one, I'll just check for questions on hygiene, public and mandated hygiene. Would thumbprints prevent ballot tampering like that in Michigan by former clerk Kathy Funk? Is there any initiative that could prevent this kind of election manipulation? Yes, actually, that's one of the other initiatives. Thumbprints goes a long way to making it difficult to cheat, but we'll talk about one of the other initiatives that can help prevent that. Okay, number 3 is probably the one that got us the most publicity: a ban on black box voting equipment. There have been a lot of accusations made about equipment from companies like Dominion and ESES. Now, some of those accusations are ones that I can't comment on because I don't know anything about, right? I don't know anything about them. So Look at America and I have never made many of the more, I'd say, inflammatory comments that have attracted lawsuits from those firms. However, we have attracted threatening letters telling us to cease and desist from Dominion, which we responded to with a good jab and a cross to the jaw, because their letters weren't about us defaming them. Their letters were trying to intimidate us from advocating for open source voting equipment and for banning black box voting equipment. So what is black box voting equipment? That is any type of voting equipment where the public is not allowed to see the software that runs it on the code level and are not allowed to see what is actually inside the box. Whether there's a router in there, whether there's not a router, how reliable the code is, whether it's hackable or not. We're not allowed to see it. Even state governments that spend hundreds of millions of dollars on contracts for these machines are not allowed to take a screwdriver and open them up and look inside. And to me, in a fair and open society dependent upon democracy, we cannot have this type of election machinery. We cannot have it because it so undercuts confidence. And if you just rewind the clock a few years, you'd find many, many prominent people on the left who now decry anybody who questions the election as a white nationalist traitor, saying that, hey, I saw these machines switch votes right in front of my eyes. Our own current vice president has said that she watched these machines be manipulated and have votes changed right before her eyes in a very well-publicized HBO documentary that we screened on the Look at America Discord. In fact, the original proposal to ban all black box voting equipment in the United States came from a Democrat in the U.S. Congress. I can't recall his name, but I do remember what he did for a living. He was a scientist, elected to office from the state of New Jersey. So this is actually an issue that has tremendous potential to be bipartisan and has been bipartisan historically. And there are other reasons to get rid of black box voting equipment, especially when you consider how much better the open source alternative. Open source means you can see exactly how the machine works, you can see exactly how the code works, you know exactly how secure it is. And all of the most secure systems, not even just election machines, but whether it's ATMs or other corporate software or web services, everything that the world is built on, by and large, is open source, and it's by far more secure than, you know, stuff like Windows, which is closed source. And one of the reasons that closed source is so vulnerable to hacking isn't necessarily by intent, but when you don't have anybody ever looking over your shoulder or checking your work gets really sloppy. And I have to suspect that one of the reasons why some of these black box voting equipment don't want to make their source code public is because they know how garbage it is, and they know how flawed it is and how sloppy it is because it's never faced any scrutiny. Whereas if you look at code from open source, where you've got many hands reviewing it, many making comments and improvements to it, it's really clean and very secure. The good analogy I like to make is that there's no place in a clear glass box to hide a trap door or a secret entrance. The other advantages of open source voting equipment is that it's much less expensive to maintain. When you buy a black box piece of equipment, voting equipment, there's only one company that can service it. There's only one company that can repair it or update it when you change your elections or update how your elections work. That's the company that sold it to you. Why? Because they're the only people who know how it works. And guess what happens when you have a monopoly over servicing election equipment? Guess what that does to the price? So we believe, based on our assessment of other open source voting equipment vendors, that states will be able to cut their costs. States, counties will be able to update their costs, reduce their costs by about 50%, cut the cost of elections in half. And then there's the third reason, which is home state jobs. Many of these black box voting equipment firms are global. They're international. And the odds are, if your state has an issue with their voting equipment, and they all do because it all has to be maintained and repaired, they've got to hire out-of-state contractors or even out-of-country contractors to update and repair them. If they go with open-sourced election equipment, they can get a tech firm right in their state to service that equipment. They can keep taxpayer dollars in their state, creating jobs in their state. Now, look, let's say you're an elected official who don't think that these machines are vulnerable, okay? You don't think the election had any kind of funny business. You don't believe that at all. You think that's just a scam or just fake news. But you can't deny the fact that these machines cost less and they create home state jobs. So if they do not agree with you on the first reason, they'll come along with you on the other two. It's very hard to resist. Home state jobs, you know, state legislators love that, and cutting costs. I mean, that's more money to either spend on something else or you can reduce taxes. Take your pick. So that's why this is one of the issues where we're most excited to work with people of different political backgrounds. In fact, some of our initial success on this has been found in the state of California, which, thanks to our effort, is now pushing through legislation to allow open source voting equipment to be certified at no cost. There are a lot of hurdles to different states being allowed to even consider open source voting equipment, but we're partnered very closely with experts in the field, and we're working with one vendor, VotingWorks, to ascertain what we can do on the activist volunteer level to educate state legislators to make open source voting equipment in their states. I'm not going to go into the weeds into that, but again, that's something we can talk about at a later time, and you can talk about with your state volunteer coordinator. Do you have any questions about open source voting equipment? Yes, could I go over how open source is less expensive? Open source is less expensive because nobody's making money on the code. That's it. And all of the parts are commodity parts. So that means that if something breaks, you can buy an off-the-shelf piece and replace it, like a hard drive or a processor or a screen. And because the public maintains the source code. Universities maintain source code for open source projects. And the other reason it's less expensive is because if I'm a vendor and I sell you a piece of software where I'm the only one who can access the code, I'm the only one that can update the code, I'm the only one that can repair the equipment, that gives me monopoly. So I can charge monopoly pricing. I don't have to compete with anybody. So that's why it's less expensive Yeah, so Darcy, good example. Car analogies. Who doesn't love a car analogy? Um, uh, I mean, imagine buying a car where you can't open the hood, where you can't take it to independent auto repair shop to get the oil changed, or to get the muffler replaced, or whatever service you need in your car. You can are only allowed to take it to the dealer, and only they're allowed to open the hood. What a dumb deal! What a horrible deal that is, right? Well, that's how our government has been purchasing voting equipment for most of the last couple generations, and it's time for that to end. One of the alternative companies, the leading company offering open source voting equipment is voting.works. So I'd encourage everybody to take a look at them. They are actively running elections in several states. And internationally, there are a lot of different open source vendors. In some places it's required. I can't remember what, there's a European country that has open source voting equipment that is freely downloadable on GitHub, which is a place where you find repositories of open source code. And Microsoft has released open source software for running elections and running voting equipment. Why? Because in third world countries, they don't trust their government to have closed black box voting equipment. So they'll only trust elections if it's run on open source software, which is why Microsoft developed it in the first place. Now, maybe you don't like Microsoft, but open source software is open source software. So either you see all the lines of code or you don't. And with this, you can. So it doesn't, you could copy it and call it your own, Look Ahead America open source software, and we could just steal Microsoft. That's within the realm of possibility of what's legal or not. So it is, I think it really is the future here. And, I'm not going to name the company, but one of these black box voting equipment firms gave China all of their patents as collateral in exchange for a massive cash loan. And guess what would happen to the value of that collateral if the country switched to open source voting equipment by requirement? What do you think those patents would be worth all of a sudden? What do you think would be the value? And how much money do you think those companies are going to spend on lobbyists to try to prevent us from getting open source software, the clean open source software for elections that we deserve? So anyway, that's a very interesting battle, and that's actually why, again, they were intimidated by us. They tried to send us threatening letters to shut us down, but we're not stopping. We're recommitted, and that is personally our number one election integrity reform that we're trying to advocate for. Number 4, appointment of a Citizens Election Supervisory Committee. Now, one of the problems with the last election is we kept hearing about suspicious things being seen or captured on video, or election observers and poll watchers being required to stay far, far away so they couldn't see what was actually going on. By the creation of a Citizens Election Supervisory Committee, that committee will include people that can be trusted from all parts of the political spectrum. And those people will be entrusted with the ability to go anywhere and see anything at any time. The same as the state's attorney general, the state's elections director, or any county board of elections leader. So there's nowhere they can't go, there's nothing they can't see. And the goal is that after an election, they've been given complete access to absolutely everything, that if they stand up and say, this was a clean election, those trucks that arrived in the middle of the night, I was there, I watched them be unloaded, and I checked them, those were ballots from a polling place on the other side of town where, the court ordered them to stay open an extra 2 hours, or whatever the reason is, right? So that's legitimate. So that can help restore confidence in the elections. Or maybe they saw something that was not appropriate. Or maybe they were denied their legal right to see absolutely everything, which completely throws an election's outcome in doubt, and I think would be grounds for having the election overturned and redone. We need to invest that type of authority in a Citizens Election Supervisory Committee. And that goes to part of the question somebody had about, what do you do about election officials who you believe are acting inappropriately? So I think that's the best defense against. And I think that's something we need to see at the state and at the county level. We need to have this committee where after the election, we may say, look, didn't like how it came out, not happy with the outcome, but it was clean and we lost it fair and square. In fact, after the 2017 election in Virginia, Look at America, we had at that election done our very first poll watching election monitoring operation. We had poll watchers in 30 polling places all across the state. And I was one of them. And I saw a clean run election as best I could. People were all being checked with IDs. Folks who did not have appropriate ID were given provisional ballots from everything I could see. So the day after the election, while I personally did not like the outcome, we put out a statement saying, look, as best we could see, there were no issues. And I think that's very important. Any questions about number 4, appointment of a Citizens Election Supervisory Committee? Okay. Number 5, creation and sufficient funding of a dedicated voter fraud investigation division within the state Attorney General's office. This idea actually came from somebody I was talking to in Texas who said that in the entire Attorney General's office in the huge state of Texas, I think the second most populated state in the country, probably soon to be the first, there's exactly one guy whose job it is to look into election and voter fraud. And that's not his only job. He's got a lot of other things going on. And, you know, I remember the aftermath of the 2020 general election, I kept hearing people say, well, we couldn't find any evidence of illegal ballots, even though our organization submitted evidence, made it public, offered to make it available. We still got that response from the Attorney General of Arizona's Attorney General office, the Attorney General there, where I physically was down there about 2.5 months ago, standing in the front of his building with a megaphone saying, hey, we delivered some data to you today, maybe you take a look at it, or they ignored it. I think that by having somebody whose dedicated job it is to look at it makes it much more likely that illegal ballots and voter fraud will be investigated, because attorneys that work in the Attorney General's office are nothing if not ambitious. And if they spend all their years and they discover nothing, that's not a good sign that they were doing their job. So I think by having a dedicated arm whose job it is to ensure election integrity, I think it makes it more likely that we're going to prevent and stop illegal ballots from being cast. And I think, again, it goes a long way to restoring the public's confidence. So when an organization like us comes with a big list of thousands of illegal ballots cast, there's somebody whose 100% job it is to prosecute that, which while the Secretary of State administers the elections, they don't have prosecution powers like the Attorney General's office does. So, look, it's not a complete solution, and, you know, in some states, they might make it a figurehead job and they don't do anything, or they just cover up for illegal ballots being cast. But I think it goes a ways to allowing one more safety check on our elections. I see a question about the previous one, appointment of Citizens Election Supervisory Committee. Who appoints? I think it doesn't matter, as long as that committee has somebody on it, at least one person on it that at least 95% of the electorate can trust, or at least one person that everybody, how do I phrase that? So that 95% of the electorate has at least one person on that committee they can trust. That's the way I meant to say it, right? Look, you're not going to get to 100%. You're not going to make 100% of the people happy. Forget it. But if you can get to like 90, 95, so if you have a Matt Braynard appointed to the state's committee, hopefully that'll go a long way. And maybe you have like some loony lefty or someone else, you know, maybe in the middle, or someone else more on my side. Look, the point of it is just to find people who are going to be trustworthy, going to be honest, regardless of their political outlook, and somebody that, again, at least 95% of the electorate can find at least one person on there that says, okay, if he says it's fair, I'll accept it. So we'll get to the final one. Equitable distribution of private contributions to election operations. So if you read the report that our research group put out just recently, phenomenal job by Ian Camacho and the research group, documenting how the election was rigged by investing significant funding from private groups, specifically funded by Mark Zuckerberg, and an operation run by hard left Democrats to dramatically lower the threshold of difficulty for voting in Democrat favorable parts of the state while not doing something equitable to red parts of the state. I mean, and not just doing it like privately, like a private service. Hey, we're going to go into Philadelphia or Fulton County and just our nonprofit's going to offer free bus rides to the polling place, which you can do, right? As a nonprofit, you're just doing your own thing, right? Get out the vote, whatever. But they were actually investing that money in election infrastructure, saying, look, we're only going to invest it in this poor part of the state that votes how we like it, and not in this poor part of the state who votes how we don't like it. and that's a problem. So that's why our legislation, our proposed legislation, or proposed objective here requires that, look, if you want to make a private contribution to how the elections work or the election system, to improve it, that's fine, but it must be equitably distributed throughout a state. So you can't just drop millions and millions of dollars in Fulton County and ignore poor old Eccles County. Now, some states have done their version of this where they completely outlaw private contributions. We technically count that as basically hitting this checkbox, because if you ban it, then you automatically have equitable distribution of private contributions. Okay, and some states have done that. I think that's fine. But if at least they're equitable, that would be okay. Because if you really are good-hearted and you really want to increase fairness in elections, then you should be allowing to be distributed wholly throughout the state, where evenly, not just in the places where you like how people vote. By the way, this sort of reminds me of something else. We talked about the ban on the use of black box voting equipment. Hey, there are some states and some people advocating for only paper ballots and only hand counting. Well, that's open source too. I mean, that checks that box as well. Technically, hand counting and using a chalkboard, that's all open source equipment. So that ticks that box. We don't quarrel with that, and we give that an A+ in terms of hitting this objective if that's the legislation that's offered. Again, it runs in sort of practicality size, but really we're just about getting these 6 objectives passed in any form. And honestly, if you have to spend a month hand counting your ballots with a chalkboard, hey, we're happy with that if you're not using Dominion's closed source voting equipment. We'll take that any day of the week. So any questions on any of these 6 before I talk about how you can help advance them? If you want to read more about them, you can find them at lookatatamerica.org/integrity. And I think we have an extended explanation of the open source initiative at lookatatamerica.org/blackbox. Let me confirm that URL is correct. Yes. So on the black box, we kind of go into much more in depth, because that one requires, it's very simple to say, hey, thumbprint on the absentee ballot. That's easy to understand. Open source versus closed source. Now, before you can even get to having why that's good, you have to explain what those terms mean. So we give you a lot more research with a one-pager on that, on black box versus open source. You can find that at lookatatamerica.org/blackbox. So now, how can you advance these? We currently have infrastructure in about 25 states where we have state volunteer coordinators who are leading volunteers to go talk to their state legislators, get educated on these public policy objectives, and ideally they would result in legislation being introduced and then eventually legislation being passed and becoming law of the land. We've seen that success. I think one of the best stories I can think of was in the state of New Jersey, where one of our activists went in, talked to her state senator. State senator then said, okay, I'd like to learn more. They brought it to the national level, where we had a much more in-depth conversation. We looked at some draft legislation with that state senator. He introduced it. It failed, but that was a giant leap for us as an organization, a giant leap for the cause of election integrity. Because over time, those objectives, so many of the laws you see passed at the state legislative level, they were introduced a long time ago. It just took a long time to get them passed, and that it does take patience at the state legislative level. And again, your voice at the state legislative level, especially when you march in there with a lot of your neighbors, a lot of your friends, a lot of your folks who share your worldview into a state legislator's office, that has a much bigger impact than, say, walking into like a U.S. congressman's office. And again, all of these elections are, I'd say 90%, if not more, regulated at the state level. And everything that we need to have fixed can get fixed at the state level. So how can you advance them? Go to lookatatamerica.org/volunteer. Sign up. We will train you. We will connect you to people in your state. We will put you to work. I don't have to ask you to raise your hands. How many times have you gone to a campaign website or a nonprofit organization website, filled out volunteer, and all you do is get spam for cash? That will not happen with us. We will put you to work. In fact, 2 weeks ago? When were we in Dallas? It was like a week ago, right? We spent 20 hours on a Saturday and Sunday in a mediocre hotel conference room next to the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, training for no cost to anybody that attended people how to do community organizing, how to do exactly what needs to be done here to advocate and propose and successfully enact these public policy objectives. It was grueling, it was brutal. I know a lot of the people that are on this call were there, but it was really, yeah, March 5th and 6th. We're ready to train you, and we didn't charge anybody anything. All you had to do was get there. And we look forward to doing another one over the summer, probably in Phoenix and Charlotte and maybe somewhere in the Midwest, maybe Cleveland. And the reason we picked Dallas-Fort Worth is because it was the cheapest city for everybody to fly to, and it had really cheap hotels right next to the airport. There was no sightseeing, there's no like fancy dinners or anything like that. It was basically grind, and then in the break, go to the fast food joint across the street from the hotel and then come back. So look, sign up to volunteer with the organization. Let us put you to work, because it's really up to us to make the success. And I mean, I can't tell you how many success stories I've heard over the last few months of folks who've never been involved with politics before, getting a hold of their state legislators, getting them educated, and then seeing legislation actually be introduced. And in many cases, getting passed. We've been documenting a lot of success that we've had in states passing our objectives. I think Arizona has passed a couple of our objectives. Other states, many of them have passed at least one of these objectives. Why? Because of folks like you going to their state legislators, educating them about subject matters they have no understanding about but are eager to learn about, because you, the constituency, cares about it, and making something happen. I do want to close with the fact that, look, if anybody can help us with contributions, it's a tax-deductible contribution at lookatAmerica.org right at the top. Everything we do, I don't think there's another organization that does more than we do, dollar for dollar. I think our annual budget's around $250,000. We have, at the national level, we have a big staff. We participate in major conferences. We support operations and projects in every state where we can put volunteer activists to work. You know, nobody's getting rich working here, because we all care about the cause. And I'm very honored to lead a very honorable group of people, both at the national level on our national staff and in our field program in Arizona, which is focused on voter registration. So anything you do to help us out, again, this conference we did that we didn't charge anybody anything for, we educated 23 new field organizers. I think the total cost of this event for us was about $3,500 there or so. We want to do these more and more across the country to educate folks so they really know what's at stake and how powerful they are to affect change. So do we have any questions before I close this up? Asking if we work with other organizations. Sometimes we do. I know that with our special project in Georgia, working with Turning Point Faith. In cases where our objectives align, we're more than happy to work with anybody. We set our flight plan to accomplish what we want to. Anybody that wants to join and work with us towards that objective, we welcome them aboard. Anything else? That was 47 minutes or 42 minutes of me talking straight. We'll be sharing this video. Don't worry, the video I'm capturing is just me, so we're not going to dox anybody for participating in this controversial far-right organization that's just trying to, secure the elections. It's just going to be me here on the screen. Any other questions? Going on. Hey, I'm appreciative of all of you folks for showing up. We'll do this again sometime soon.
Matt?
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for having the presentation. Anyway, I just wanted to ask one question. What's your feeling on actually seeing a decertification before the 2024 on any state, even Wisconsin, which seems to be the closest? I know it's just an opinion, and I won't hold you to the fire. And thanks again for all the work you do.
I have no idea. I have no idea. Our focus has been finding illegal ballots, putting them into reports, putting them in front of people, identifying legislation that does a good job, bad job, an okay job, putting on presentations like this, training activists. So that's sort of outside the scope of where my focus has been and where the organization's focus has been. So I'm not really an expert. We did put together a report, and we actually have provided a lot of information to the state legislators in Wisconsin who are working on this. We've given them unredacted data on our Wisconsin report, documenting like, I don't know, 4 or 5 times the number of illegal ballots to the margin of victory in that state. So we're happy to provide data whether a state decertifies or doesn't decertify or passes laws that fix the problems or puts in place our objectives. That's at their point in their hands. So we're just there to provide the information, educate them, and encourage them to go in the right direction. Any other questions?
Thank you.
All right. On that, I will end the meeting and end the recording. As always, America first, America forever.